More sure word. Kingdoms detailed. Part 1. Context. All these kingdoms being described here arose in the same geographical area, what we now know as North Africa, Asia, and Europe. Following the flood and the destruction of the Earth's surface, the vast majority of humanity lived in this region of the world. In Daniel's vision, all the beasts arise out of the sea. Reading Revelation 17:15, we learn that large bodies of water represent highly populated regions. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, a sea of people before. In Genesis 41, the Pharaoh received a dream describing an east wind that blasted the corn in his dream. This was a symbol of the impending famine as interpreted by Joseph. Similarly, one of the plagues that destroyed Egypt was brought in by an east wind. The winds in Daniel's dream did not hit food. They came from the 4 points on the compass and struggled over the large population of people. This tells us that these winds refer to wars. Babylon, head of gold. In the interpretation, Daniel declared that Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon were the head of gold. Daniel also stated that the God of heaven had made Nebuchadnezzar ruler over the territory where humanity dwells, and where the beasts of the field and the birds of the air are. This imagery of Nebuchadnezzar's far reach is repeated in another dream that Nebuchadnezzar received about himself, recorded in Daniel chapter 4. In this dream, he was represented by a large tree with branches, producing much fruit and feeding all that dwelt under it. Nebuchadnezzar attempted to defy the interpretation of the image dream, refusing to accept that his kingdom would come to an end. To signify this, he had an image made completely of gold and forced all the chief leaders of his empire to worship the image. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who had been elevated to high ranks in the kingdom, did not bow to this image. Consequently, they were thrown into a fiery furnace. There the Lord performed a miracle in Nebuchadnezzar's sight. Jesus came down and stood with the Hebrews in the furnace, protecting them. Nebuchadnezzar called them out of the fire and praised the God of heaven. Babylon, eagle-winged lion. The eagle-winged lion is a known iconography from the ancient Babylonian kingdom. It represented the dominance of Babylon among all the kingdoms, such that all the worldly kingdoms that arise subsequent to it has strived to attain to its status, with some maintaining the name literally and symbolically, as seen in Ezra 5:13 and in Revelation 17:5. We know the lion as the king of the jungle, and Daniel described Nebuchadnezzar as a king of kings in Daniel chapter 2. However, this lion does not remain a mere beast. It stands up like a man and receives a man's heart. In Daniel chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar's testimony in his own words of his conversion experience. Nebuchadnezzar's beastly pride was brought into judgment by the God of heaven. For 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar wandered the fields as a beast eating grass. Following this experience, his mind was restored and he extolled the God of heaven. Nebuchadnezzar, now humbled, was restored to the head of his kingdom, Babylon, until his death. Then, the next account of the Babylonian Empire is in chapter 5, when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was in command. He did not learn from his grandfather's experience. He defied the God of heaven by drinking alcohol from the sacred vessels belonging to the Lord's temple. In the midst of his reveling, the hand of God passed judgment on him and the kingdom of Babylon. That night, the Medes and the Persians took over the kingdom and killed Belshazzar, just as foretold by the prophet Isaiah over a century before. Medo-Persia, chest and arms of silver. The kingdom of the Medes and the Persians under the leadership of Cyrus overtook the Babylonian Empire. The two arms are significant of the fact that this kingdom was a federation of two nations. This kingdom was not as magnificent as the Babylonian Empire, but powerful in its own right. The Medes and the Persians were conscientious, temperate, thoughtful people. In Daniel chapter 6, we read that Daniel was again elevated to a high standing in this kingdom, above all the other appointed leaders in the kingdom's hierarchy. This engendered jealousy among the other leaders, because Daniel was a captive of Judah and worshipped differently than they did. However, Darius appreciated Daniel's diligence, faithfulness, and obvious connection with the God of heaven. When he was tricked by the envious leaders, condemning Daniel to death, because of his experience with Daniel, he believed that Daniel's God would save him. Again, the Lord worked a miracle to preserve his servant in the sight of a heathen king. Medo-Persia, tilted bear. In Daniel's vision, the Medo-Persian kingdom was represented by a bear raised up on one side, with 3 ribs in its mouth. This kingdom was commanded to devour much flesh, humanity, or the living. The presence of the 3 ribs between its teeth demonstrates that it obeyed this command. Historically, we know that the Medo-Persian Empire subdued 3 kingdoms in its path to domination: the Lydians, the Egyptians, and the Babylonians. The bear was raised on one side because one of its 2 sides was more dominant. Cyrus, the general who led the defeat of these 3 nations, was Persian. The Persians were the more dominant of the 2. Cyrus was also the Persian king ordained by the Lord to restore the captives of Judah to their land after the 70 years were completed, as prophesied in Isaiah 44:28. A temporary delay occurred in the fulfillment of this prophecy, as recorded in Daniel 10:13, when Satan attempted to influence Cyrus not to issue the decree. However, we read in Ezra 1 verse 2, King Cyrus's declaration under whose command he issued the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Medo-Persia, Two-Horned Ram. In the vision recorded in chapter 8, Daniel's guide plainly states the name of the kingdom represented by the two-horned ram. The difference in the dominance of the 2 groups in this kingdom is seen clearly in the ram's representation. The ram had 2 horns, which we recognize as kings, line of kings, or kingdoms. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up second. Darius the Mede was the first king of Media and Persia after they overthrew Belshazzar. He was succeeded by Cyrus the Persian, of the more dominant group. Even in the naming of the kingdom, we see the shift in dominance. In Daniel, the kingdom was known as Media and Persia. However, during the time of Esther, the kingdom was known as Persia and Media. And by the time of Ezra, it was simply known as Persia. The ram was also described as pushing to the west, north, and south. Given the location of Persia, modern-day Iran, we can see the push would be the overthrow of Babylon to the west, Lydia, modern-day Turkey, to the north, and Egypt to the south. The three nations overthrown by Medo-Persia during their rise to power. Greece, belly and thigh of brass. From history, we know the kingdom that displaced Persia and Media was Greece. The Greek kingdom is known for their use of bronze in armory. During the Greco-Persian War, their armor was made of this copper alloy. Just as silver is less valuable than gold, copper is less valuable than silver. However, the copper used to signify the Grecian kingdom is an alloy. It is mixed with another metal, such as zinc or tin. This amalgamation of metals results in an impure but stronger substance. The Greeks were known for their interest in godless knowledge, human reasoning, and philosophy. The first king of this empire was educated by a famous philosopher, Aristotle. The power behind this kingdom is identified in Daniel 10, verse 20, as the enemy of God's people. Even after their kingdom passed away, their influence was felt beyond the time of the Messiah and even into our current times. Greece, Four-Headed Leopard. In Daniel chapter 7, the Grecian kingdom is represented by a four-headed leopard with four wings like a bird. A leopard is known for its speed as one of the fastest land animals in the world, clocking up to 40 miles per hour. The four wings also represent speed, but they are regular bird's wings, not eagle's wings like Babylon's lion. This signifies that this kingdom is not as majestic in its speed. The four heads signify the four divisions of this kingdom. With great speed, the Grecian kingdom conquered the then known world, marching its army from one nation to another. Following this, the kingdom split into four notable parts. Greece, rough he-goat. In chapter 8, more of Greece's history is revealed. This kingdom is represented by a rough he-goat with a distinctive horn in the middle of its head that did not touch the ground. This goat demolished the ram representing the kingdom of Media and Persia. The Bible tells us that the distinctive horn represents the first king. The Grecian king who conquered the then known world from Greece to India in a stunningly short period of time was Alexander the Great. He subdued all that was once part of the Persian Empire and made it Greek. Following his rapid campaign of domination, he died at the age of 32 with no known heirs. The Bible signifies this in verse 8, where we see that this single notable horn was broken off. The horn was then succeeded by four notable horns that went in the four directions. Having died so young with no known heirs, Alexander the Great was succeeded by four of his generals: Ptolemy, who took control of the southern part of the empire; Cassander, who controlled the west; Lysimachus controlled the north; and Seleucus, the east. Here's a summary of what we have so far in the book of Daniel. The Babylonian Empire, represented by the head of gold and the eagle-winged lion, was defeated by Cyrus the Persian. giving rise to the kingdom of Media and Persia, as recorded in Daniel 5. Their empire lasted from 605 BC to 539 BC. The Medo-Persian Empire, represented by the chest and arms of silver, the tilted bear, and the two-horned ram, was conquered by Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, giving rise to the kingdom of Grecia. Their empire lasted from 539 BC to 331 BC. The Grecian Empire, represented by the belly and thighs of brass, the four-headed, four-winged leopard, and the rough goat, was overthrown by Rome. Their empire lasted from 331 BC to 168 BC. Next time, we'll analyze the details of the remaining powers described in Daniel.